Breaking news, the Republican-dominated North Carolina Supreme Court rules that 60,000 votes in the closely contested judicial election for state Supreme Court will be counted, but says that another 5,000 to 7,000 votes have to go through an onerous cure process, continuing to put in doubt the outcome of this election won by the Democratic candidate. Welcome back to Democracy Docket. I'm Mark Elias.
And I'm Paige Moskowitz. Let's get started.
Okay, so it wouldn't be a Friday afternoon if we didn't get a very complex ruling from the North Carolina Supreme Court in what has been a saga, an ongoing saga, in that state Supreme Court's judicial election that took place in November. That in that election, the incumbent Justice Democratic candidate Allison won over Jefferson Griffin by a narrow margin, by a little more than 700 votes. There was a recount. Allison won again. There was another partial recount, which she again won. And then the Republican candidate, backed by the Republican Party, began this strategy to try to disenfranchise thousands and thousands of North Carolina voters who had really done nothing wrong in an effort to flip the outcome of this election. And Paige, in order to understand this, people need to keep in mind the various buckets of ballots here at issue. There is one bucket of more than 60,000 votes, which were essentially voters who followed the form that was used to register to vote, that the North Carolina courts seemed to not think was the proper form or didn't include all the necessary information. And as a result of this ruling, those votes will be counted. So those 60,000 votes will be counted. There are two other buckets, though. One is a bucket of voters who were military and overseas voters who did not submit photocopies of their identification along with their vote, their ballot. And then finally, a category of ballots cast by people whose parents were residents of North Carolina, who were presumably born overseas and who have claimed North Carolina residence. And it is those two remaining ballots that we're going to talk about here, Paige, because they are what is going to be in hot dispute moving forward.
Right, Mark, let's start with the military and overseas ballots, because this is one of the most egregious claims that Jefferson Griffin has made. Now, these are ballots, like you said, from military and overseas voters, North Carolinians who are currently out of the country. And Jefferson Griffin is saying that they didn't submit a copy of their photo ID with their mail-in ballots when they voted. Therefore, their ballot should be discarded. However, Democratic Justice on the Supreme Court, Anita Earls, in this ruling today, points out that Jefferson Griffin is really only targeting military and overseas voters from Democratic counties in North Carolina. He's not targeting these voters statewide. Earls referred to it as a surgical strike by Jefferson Griffin to really only target military and overseas voters who may have cast a ballot for Allison.
Yeah, Paige, I think you got it exactly right with this category of ballots. There's sort of two issues here. The first is, why the hell are these voters being disenfranchised at all, right? Because after all, these are military and overseas voters who, again, followed the instructions that were given to them. But because the Republicans don't like those instructions and think they don't comply with state law, have decided that those ballots shouldn't count. Now, this is further complicated by the fact that the time that this vote took place, which was in November of 2024, was also a presidential year, and their federal law would control what happens with these military and overseas voters. So there's a lot of sort of confusion around that is being taken advantage of by Republicans, including the majority of the state Supreme Court, to essentially disenfranchise these voters. But the real key, Paige, to what is going on here is not highlighted in the majority opinion. It is only highlighted in Justice Earl's partial dissent. And that is that Jefferson Griffin and the Republican Party didn't object to all military and overseas ballots being subjected to this standard. Oh, no, because you might think about it this way. If they had done that all throughout the state, that would harm Democratic areas and Republican areas all alike. And who knows who would win or lose there. Jefferson Griffin only challenged Guilford County, which is the home to Greensboro. It is the home to a large population of Black voters. It has several universities in it. It is one of the handful of Democratic strongholds in the state. I mean, I guess they could have really gone for it and said, we're only doing Guilford County and Durham County, and then maybe we'd really understand what they were up to. But this is clear that they targeted one county, and rather than the state Supreme Court at least wrestling with this issue and saying, look, we're just going to apply this statewide, right? Republicans wouldn't want that. Or we're going to count them all. Republicans wouldn't want that. They have created a circumstance in which the same kind of ballot that was submitted by an overseas and military voter in County 1 is counted without challenge, and in County 2 now has to go through this made-up cockamamie cure process. So, look, this is going to get challenged in federal court, and I rarely go this far out on a limb, but if there's one thing that federal law we have learned stands for after Bush versus Gore is that you cannot have a state court that has the ability to impose a uniform counting standard and refuse to do so, that is allowed to stand. And this, I suspect, is going to not only be challenged, but is going to be challenged successfully. But Paige, this was only one of the two buckets of ballot challenges that the Republican-dominated court let go through.
Right, Mark, there's a third bucket of voters, so-called never resided voters. Now, presumably, these are people who were born abroad. They have never lived in the United States, physically within the bounds of the United States, but their parents or guardians were last domiciled in North Carolina, so they claim North Carolina residency for the purposes of voting. And the question is, can these people actually vote in North Carolina? Now, Mark, every single state has a different rule regarding never resided voters. So North Carolina, Jefferson Griffin said this is a prime time to sort this rule out here. This affects about 200 voters. The North Carolina Supreme Court says that their ballot should be thrown out as well, with no opportunity to cure or find a remedy to fix it.
Right. And this is, again, controversial for a couple of reasons. The first is that you are essentially disenfranchising this category of American citizens to say basically they are stateless. I mean, if every state took this position, if all 50 states said this is our position, then you have created a category of stateless U.S. citizens, which is simply not going to be the outcome here, right? It is not the fact that simply because you were born overseas and have lived overseas, that you somehow remain completely stateless. So I believe that a federal court is going to remedy this. But again, they only targeted one county. They didn't target these individuals all throughout the state. So it may be that this whole stateless, non-stateless issue never even has to be resolved, because there is just a clear application of federal constitutional law here. The final wrinkle here, Paige, is that, of course, 200 votes is not enough votes to change the outcome of the election, right? So the action is really in that second bucket. It's in that second bucket of ballots where you just, a casual observer coming to this would be like, that's interesting. The Republicans want to throw out the military ballots? Like, huh? Like, why would they want to do that? And that's why you need to have this additional context, and it is the reason why I always say that people need to subscribe to Democracy Docket, because, the mainstream media and the legacy media, they'll cover stories like this and give you sort of high level. But if you want to understand the nuance about what is really going on in these cases, what's going to happen next, what is the context, what happens in one case affect something perhaps down the road in another state, the place to go is Democracy Docket. You can become a free or premium member by clicking on the link above or in the show notes below.
Mark, I want to talk about another aspect of Justice Earle's partial dissent, which is that she talks about how this is basically administrative chaos to try to carry out this order, right? You have to identify all of these people. You have to mail them notice. They have to mail it back. But Mark, at the end of the day, how do you take out an impacted voter's ballot out of the vote count if it's already been cast and counted, right? Like, isn't the whole premise that there is a secret ballot? Nobody can know who you actually voted for. But now the courts are saying you need to be able to connect a ballot to a person's name 5 months after the fact so that we can remove it from the vote count if necessary.
There's a lot of administrative challenges here. I mean, you could start with the fact that you are dealing with a population of people who are overseas. Okay, number one. Number two, a large number of them are actually active duty military, which means they could be on ships if they're in the Navy, they could be out out in combat zones, depending on the service they're in. I mean, the idea that somehow you are within 30 days going to do all of these things, get this stuff out to people, and then, by the way, get it all back, and then figure out everything we were talking about, and then you recanvass them, you retotal them. I mean, this is not set up to work. This is set up by a Republican-dominated state Supreme Court to relieve from it the pressure it was feeling by the fact that people like you and me and others were kept hammering away that Republicans are trying to throw out more than 60,000 votes. So what did this state court do? They said, okay, we'll take the 60,000 votes off the table. And now it looks like we gave a mixed ruling. Now it looks like we actually gave more to the Democratic side than the Republican side. After all, the Republicans wanted all 67,000 ballots not to count, and we're only putting at play the 7,000. But here's the thing. They set up a rule that is skewed in their favor, that is going to be impossible to administer. And then what will they do? They'll blame Guilford County. Well, won't that be convenient, right? Because again, it is a Democratic county. And, Paige, how many videos have you and I done over the years in which this is the playbook? May I remind you of Harris County? Remember that, Paige?
Right. Republicans love to target specific Democratic counties. If you'll remember, in Texas, Harris County, home to Houston, largest Democratic stronghold in the state, also just so happens to be the only county that is unable to choose how the leadership structure is set up to administer elections. The state legislature took that over for them, and they continue to target Harris County in their election practices.
Yeah. So where do we go from here? So this goes back now to the Court of Appeals for it to write another order that sort of puts this all in practice. But the real action now is going to be in federal court. And already we have seen Justice Allison Riggs, the Democratic candidate, file a lawsuit. I suspect we are going to see a series of lawsuits, not only on behalf of the campaign or the candidate, but also probably affected voters. I mean, this is a calamity for North Carolina. It's a real self-inflicted black eye that literally just shows that the Republicans don't care about trashing their own election systems. But ultimately, I suspect this is going to get resolved in federal court. I do want to give one shout out, Paige. We talk a lot about the fact that the North Carolina Supreme Court is Republican dominated. And we talk about the fact that increasingly it has been a very partisan court. There was another dissent from a Republican justice, Justice Dietz, who I don't know much about him, but he is a Republican state Supreme Court justice, and he was actually initially opposed to the state Supreme Court even entertaining this on principled grounds, and his dissent is on principled grounds. He essentially says, look, I agree with much of the arguments that the Republicans are making here, but these claims should have been brought before the election. These should have been brought before people were voting. It's not fair to the voters to make these changes after the voting has taken place. He adopts sort of a state analog of the Purcell doctrine to say, it's just too late. And whether you agree or don't agree with that exact analogy, or whether you agree or don't agree with his reasoning, I do want to give a shout out to him, because we are quick to point out when we think that Republican judges are maybe putting a thumb on the scale on behalf of Republican candidates, and he didn't do it. And so kudos to him.
Yeah, Justice Dietz had an interesting dissent. He says, I expected that when the time came, our state courts surely would embrace the universally accepted principle that courts cannot change election outcomes by retroactively rewriting the law. I was wrong. And in this day and age, that's kind of incredible to hear from a Republican, an elected Republican. This is a man who ran with Republican after his name on the ballot.
And through a Republican primary.
Presumably taking money from GOP donors, saying, guys, what are we doing here? But that's just a sign of the times we live in. Now, Democracy Docket will continue to track this case closely. Like we said, Justice Riggs has filed in federal court. This ruling from the North Carolina Supreme Court is going back down to the lower courts to play out a bit. You can expect Democracy Docket to follow along and keep you updated every step of the way.
Yeah. And so again, please take this opportunity to click on the link above or in the show notes below to become a Democracy Docket subscriber so that you get timely, accurate information and analysis about this case and all other cases like it. I can also promise you that Paige and I will stay on top of this. Thanks for watching this edition of Democracy Docket. We'll see you next time.